DevelopSec, developing security awareness with James Jardine, brought to you by Jardine Software. Hi, and welcome to episode 22 of the DevelopSec podcast. I am your host, James Jardine, and today I want to talk a little bit about blacklists and whitelists when we talk about input validation. We also use blacklists and whitelists when we talk about output and coding, especially in the area of cross-site scripting, maybe SQL injection, command injection. And so I came across an interesting picture somebody posted on Twitter, and it showed a walkway in front of like a strip mall type area, and on the sidewalk it said no bicycle riding, rollerblading, roller skating, skateboarding, scooter riding. And then right next to that sign is a guy on a unicycle riding down the sidewalk. And somebody had posted about a good picture for whitelist versus blacklist evangelism. And I thought it was interesting because as the picture shows, right, as you get, unicycling wasn't listed there. So, I mean, is the person on the unicycle okay? They're not against the list that was actually there. Is it this loophole? It's this idea that we want to try to cover everything we can. So let's take a step back for a moment. Whitelist versus blacklist. Let's start with blacklist first because that's what this sign is. This is what's not allowed, right? The blacklist is these are the known bads. Don't allow these in. And in this case, we're saying, hey, we've got 5 different things that we say, hey, we don't want this on our sidewalk. Now, maybe you're okay with more than that, but here's a concrete list. There's no exception. None of these are allowed. And so the blacklist can be fairly large when you start really thinking about it. But in most cases, we started off small, and we list out those things. Look at for output and coding. We look at a blacklist, HTML and code in .NET, right, where we have just maybe 5 things that we're looking for to say, look, if I see a less than symbol, if I see a greater than symbol, if I see a double quote, a single quote, right, I'm going to go ahead and encode those characters because I know they're bad. Now, that doesn't mean that we've gotten every bad character, but we're making an attempt to get some of them. So we're going with known bads. The other side of that is the whitelisting. And with whitelisting, we're going with known goods. And we're saying, hey, I'm only going to allow these values. And then I'm going to do something else with the rest of them. All right. So on input validation, maybe on a first name field, I'm going to only allow A through Z and maybe 1 or 2, right? Maybe there's a hyphen in a name. Maybe there's a single quote. I don't know. Names are getting weird these days. But maybe we got just a few of those. So we limit it down and we say, you know what? Known good characters. And let's, for simplicity's sake, say, hey, look, we're going to limit it to alpha characters. No numbers. When we were first starting to have children, I told my wife I was going to name, if we had a girl, I was going to name her Kate, and it was going to be K followed by the number 8. But that's neither here nor there. But if we go look at this and say, I'm going to limit it down to letters only. That's it. That's my known good list. Everything else, I'm going to throw out because that's not valid for my first name. Well, then I've done better than a blacklist. Because a blacklist, I'd have to actually list out and say, okay, what are the characters I'm not going to allow? Well, let's see, I don't want the hyphen, I don't want the ampersand. Think of every special character, all the numbers, all these characters. That's a lot large. It's a greater list than what we have when we're just talking about saying, hey, I'm just going to allow A through Z. That's it. And that regex is simple. But when we start talking about, hey, let's pick out all these exact items, I don't want these. Now all of a sudden our list grows. So in most cases we see that our blacklist is much larger once fully realized than what our whitelist would be. And the other benefit to the whitelist is the blacklist, as we can see in this picture, right, we missed something. We missed unicycling. So, okay, That one got by. Do we update our sign? How do we update our list to now get that? What do we do about items that fell out of our list? In the programming world, right, maybe we have some other thing that catches that on the backside. Okay, here's our blacklist, and this is going to be our first layer of defense. Hey, block these 5 characters. And then on the next layer of defense, I've got something else I'm looking for, and I'm going to block it there, or I'm going to encode it there. So we may have defenses for that, but the interesting thing I found, and this kind of brought up an interesting Twitter conversation, if you can have one of those at 140 characters a swipe. But so I asked out, I said, what would the whitelist be if you're talking about this situation with no bicycle riding, rollerblading, roller skating, skateboarding, scooter riding, but now you've got a unicyclist? So, valid question. What would that whitelist look like? Because, I mean, I get it. Whitelists are better or more secure in general than a blacklist because of the inclusiveness that a whitelist has. So what would it be? And so I got one response back, and it was unassisted movement only. I was like, okay, that's interesting. I mean, that's a good first stab. But what about a wheelchair? What about crutches? People that have some sort of disability or handicap that need assistance. What about me pushing a baby stroller? I mean, that's assisted movement, but I got to be able to push a baby stroller up there. I'd have to think, right? I have to be able to get a wheelchair up there. And so what it highlighted to me is that, well, in the security industry, we constantly say, oh, you got to use whitelist over blacklist. You got to use whitelist over blacklist. It can be difficult to define what that whitelist is. And in addition to that, when we define a whitelist, it takes away, or has the ability to take away, much more functionality if it's too stringent than if we do that with a blacklist, right? If I take this blacklist and I just write these 5 things, okay, I can put a wheelchair on there. I can put a baby stroller on there. Yeah, we got away with a unicycle on there. Okay, but I'm still using it. As a wheelchair user, as a parent with a stroller, I'm still using that sidewalk, and it's okay. Yes, something got through, but what if we did the flip side? What if we posted a sign that said, no unassisted movement, or unassisted movement only? Well, now everybody that should be able to use that are legitimate users, wheelchairs, strollers, crutches, you name it, electronic wheelchairs, they're all blocked now, right? Now they are against that sign, and you've now impeded the proper use of your area. And it's the same thing when we talk about in the digital world, where if I go ahead and I say, hey, look, I'm going to whitelist and only allow alphanumeric characters for their first name. Okay. But now if we get anybody that has an apostrophe in their name, and we're seeing that more commonly, we've all heard random stories of people with dashes in their name that may exist out there. Well, what about those people? What if we find that somebody's hyphenating their first name, or that's how they portray their first name, is hyphenated? What if they have a single quote or an apostrophe in there? Well, with my whitelist on my first stab, I said, nope, just alpha characters, nothing else. We'll reject it all. Well, now you're keeping people from using your site. You're keeping people from using your application, which is what generates the revenue for your application, right? Whereas with my blacklist, if I gone in and said, hey, I'm going to blacklist this, but I didn't really blacklist everything. Maybe I didn't blacklist the apostrophe or the single quote, right? Maybe I didn't blacklist the hyphen. Maybe I said, you know what? I know some known characters that aren't in there, right? Cash is not going to use my site, so I'm going to go ahead and allow the $sign to be blocked, %sign, carets, ampersands, asterisks, parentheses, right? I'm going to block those items. And it's a pretty small blacklist, right? But it's going to keep most of my trouble out. But I'm going to allow some of the other stuff, right? Because those may be in there. So now the site is still more... the usability is there because you're not really blocking anybody, because those really aren't going to show up in a name, but there's still a chance that we could find out one of those is bad. With the blacklist, we go back to HTML and code. HTML and code did not used to include the single quote as something to blacklist. They updated that in one of the updates. So we realized, hey, wait a minute, people use that to delimitate stuff. That could actually be a bad character. We should start encoding that. Okay, it didn't say, hey, encode everything except for alphanumeric, which would be a little bit better. But at least it grew to expand a little bit. Now, it doesn't, HTML attribute encode still doesn't have a space character as one of the characters that gets encoded by default. So there's still a gap there. Interesting, a space and a gap. But there's a gap there because in an attribute, you can actually delimitate attributes with nothing, right? You can say title equals and then the attribute. You don't have to put a single quote. You don't have to put a double quote. And then it'll just say, hey, when the next space comes, that says, hey, my attribute's over. And people use that technique. I don't know why. And so in those cases, it's still possible that you could HTML attribute your code and still run into an issue because we don't do anything with the space character. Right? Whereas if we were doing a whitelist, we're saying, hey, look, we're going to allow alphanumeric. Everything else we're going to encode. That's going to include the apostrophe. That's going to include the double quote. That's going to include spaces. Any other special characters automatically get encoded. Right? So there's a difference there in how they work. But what I want you to take away is that just because we always yell, whitelist, 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 right, doesn't mean that the first time we go put one together, it's going to work. We really have to put a lot of thought into what our whitelist is. And, you know, I've done development for a long time. I understand how the requirements come across the table. Hey, what's the requirements for the first field? For the first name field? Oh, first name, whatever you think it is. What's the requirements for that account number field? It's account number. Okay, well, is it 5 zeros followed by some characters? Is it, how is this thing actually defined? Because once we determine how the field is defined, then we can go about determining our lists, right? Whether it's a blacklist or a whitelist. Don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of whitelists. I do believe they are more secure, but I also believe that we have to take some time to really think about that list, right? In the case of this, right, it was real easy to come back and say unassisted movement only, right? And that was just a first off-the-cuff response that was thrown out there. There really wasn't a lot, I don't think, of thought into, hey, what are the different ways we could do this? But at the same time, it's a good example of, you might look at a field, oh yeah, whitelist that? Sure, let's just throw alphanumeric characters and that's all we need. Everything else discard, or everything else decode, encode, whatever we're doing. And then find out that if you had analyzed it a little bit more, you would have realized there was one or two more characters that still needed to fall into that whitelist. As I mentioned earlier in this podcast, if we mess up a whitelist and make it too strict, there's a chance it could decrease the usability of our site to where we're blocking people from using our stuff. So we want to get that right? Whereas a blacklist, I miss a few things. It gives more access to my site, which, right? I mean, we're still allowing the people we want to allow in, and maybe we're allowing some people we don't want to allow in. But at the same time, we should be protecting that at another level, right? We should have the output encoding. We should have, when we have input validation, yeah, here's our list of here's what we're going to allow, but there should be other checks depending on what we're going to. We don't rely solely on input validation to protect against SQL injection, command injection, cross-site scripting, right? Input validation is our first line of defense. Hey, let's not even take junk we know we don't want. But that doesn't mean that junk didn't get in. We still need to do the protection on the other side to say, I'm taking this data, I'm sending it out to SQL, make sure I'm using my parameterized queries, or I'm using my ORM, or I'm using whatever I am to protect that data to say, you know what, I still really don't trust this data. Let me make sure that any control characters are being escaped, that I'm sending it to that system the proper way. So, kind of interesting. I thought it was interesting. I saw it a couple days ago, the picture out on Twitter. And, I thought it was a great chance to start talking a little bit more about the whitelist versus the blacklist. I believe we've talked about it a little bit before in previous episodes. But, nothing wrong with talking about stuff more than once, right? Repetition helps build it into the brain. So, we'll keep doing it. But I like finding things like this on Twitter that are good examples, that do help spark this conversation where we don't just throw something out there and say, hey, look, this is exactly the reason why whitelists are better than blacklists. It's not that cut and dry. We need to look at it. We need to analyze it. And we need to make sure that what we're doing is right for our application, for our system, for our environment, because not everything matches up perfectly everywhere. So I thank everybody for listening. Again, I have the website up and going. I'll probably actually write something about the blacklist versus the whitelist. Some thoughts that go along with this, although more thoughts are usually here because it's easier and faster to say it than it is to type it. But I'll put something up there, but you can come out and visit us at DevelopSec.com and, read some of the articles. Constantly looking for different articles talking about things that have happened with other companies that we can learn from, right? Get some of these takeaways. So I appreciate everybody listening. On Twitter, it's at DevelopSec. And if you have any questions, any feedback, please don't hesitate. Send it over to me. Ideas for the podcast. I'd love to talk about just about anything. Hopefully I try to keep this podcast fairly, technology specific, security specific, to you guys, right? The developers, the QAs, the business analysts, the people that are implementing stuff. This is where we want to get some of this information across. So that wraps up episode 22. And we'll talk to you again next time. You have been listening to the DevelopSec podcast with James Jardine. Follow us on Twitter at DevelopSec and visit our website at www.developsec.com for more episodes and information.